Thank you all for coming this evening, and I'm sorry for the delay, but we're all set up now and ready to go. I'm Jeff Leventon from the Department of Ecology and Evolution, and this evening is the culmination of the last major event, or actually the next to the last major event, as I'll mention in a second, of a really wonderfully successful Earthstock week. And we have to thank a large number of people. I will mention not a single name, but I want to say that there's been a very large group of people, 50 students, volunteers who've been so important in making this work. We have a couple of important leaders. So I'll just briefly mention and cite Jeff Barnett, who has really been so important in running Earthstock and making it work, and also Malcolm Bowman from the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. That's the way I get to take a picture of me, as I mentioned his name. And I'd like to thank them both very much for such an important effort this weekend and today. I also want to thank Karen Kernan. Oh yeah, come on, clap. And I also want to thank Karen Kernan, who put together the wonderful undergraduate research display that occurred on Wednesday, where there were over 200 research posters from undergraduates in this room. It was completely packed. But now there's a remainder of posters, not all of them, but related to, but most of the environmental posters from the Wednesday are on display this evening. So I'd like to thank her as well. And before we go to the main event of the evening, we have a couple of awards to give. The first one is an award that's in its first year, and it's the Environmental Citizen of the Year. This is being awarded by the Stony Brook Greening Committee, which is part of the Stony Brook University Environmental Club, a very successful and very large club on campus. And we're going to, very proud to announce the recipient of this award, who unfortunately couldn't be here this evening. Her name is Carla Rodriguez. I'd love to say I know she can hear you, but she can't. She has been lauded by her peers as an environmentally conscious campus citizen. She's also been a very important environmental educator on campus and supporter of many activities, all related to the concept of sustainability. And so we're honored to have Carla as the recipient of this award. And I'm going to ask Carolyn Dwyer, the head of this committee, to come up and receive the certificate that she will pass on to Carla. Carolyn?
It's your camera.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have one last award. This is the Jeffrey Eng Memorial Scholarship in Environmental Studies, endowed by the family of Jeffrey Eng, who was a freshman who very sadly died in an accident a number of years ago, and his family was wonderfully responsive. Obviously, they were in great mourning, but they responded and endowed a scholarship to an excellent student, both excellent as a student in environmental studies and also in need. And this year's winner is Alexandra Santiago. I'm not going to read all of the honors and activities that she has participated in, but it's truly a wonderful array. She's been involved in various types of environmental leadership organizations. She was part of the water brigade that went down to Honduras this past year, and as did Malcolm Bowman, to set up a very large water course. And I think many of us who work in environmental science know that the fundamental thing that limits human populations and health around the world is water, more than almost anything else. And this group has combined health and the building with their sweat of these water courses. She also has a great GPA average, and she's involved in all sorts of activities on campus. So let's give her another hand for getting this forward. Thanks very much, Alex. Okay. So now I have one more duty to perform. But before performing that duty, let me remind you that after this is over, you will be excited and motivated and interested and want to look at Andy Revkin's books, both of which are up for sale in the back, and he might even be persuaded to sign them for you. He will be sitting back there as well after his talk. And the other thing is that after this, don't rush to the bar. First, buy a book. But after that, there will be music and drink in the University Cafe. And we'll have Jack's Waterfall do music. They're really great, and I think many of you have seen them know that this will be great. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the provost of our university, but sad for us, the next president of the University of Minnesota, who introduced tonight's speaker, Eric Kaler.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and welcome you to our Earthstock keynote speech tonight. Given by a person who, for this audience, I doubt really needs an introduction. His name's Andy Revkin. He's a leading environmental journalist and informs us now through his very well-known blog, the New York Times .Earth blog. Andy was formerly a successful New York Times reporter, and the subjects of his reporting have literally ranged all over the world, from tropical rainforests to the North Pole. He excels in explaining not only environmental phenomena and catastrophes, such as Hurricane Katrina, but also illustrates very well the human dimension of communication and why environmental protection efforts succeed and sometimes fail on the public stage. Andy has written several books, two of which I think are on the back table tonight. They include The Burning Season, which follows the life of Chico Mendez, the assassinated defender of the Amazon rainforest and its people. He's also written The North Pole Was Here, which chronicles the past and future of the Arctic in the face of climate change, very dramatic climate change, as you know. His work has been transformed into several films, and his accomplishments have been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship and the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism from Columbia University. Before joining the New York Times, Andy was a senior editor of Discover, a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times, and a senior writer at Science Digest. In support of Stony Brook's commitment to environmental awareness and sustainability, Andy will talk to us tonight about which comes first, peak everything or peak us. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Andy to the podium.
Thank you. And good luck up in Minnesota with all those interesting flying insects.
Closer to the Arctic, that's good.
That's true. It's great to be here. I'm going to try to get into high gear in a hurry because we got off to a little slow start, and I want to make sure there's a lot to cover. You know, the future of the planet is ours to shape. And I think I want to start with a couple of key words. One is phrases that need to kind of go away. The environmental movement that I grew up with, are the sense of initiative, the sense of how do you get going, was framed around two phrases: woe is me and shame on you. It was always somebody's fault, usually a big company or some bad political actor. And the woe is me part was, look at the mess we've made. And what I've learned in nearly 30 years of writing about all this stuff now, I can't believe that that's such a ridiculous thing to even ponder. In migrating from studying the biogeophysical planet more and more to studying the planet inside here, I came way too late to this part, the sociology, psychology. All these scientists that I've gotten to know the last few years who write about things like cultural cognition. In other words, how our internal filters shape how we perceive not only nature, but each other and the nature of problems and the risks that we either ignore or act on. And without a deep consideration of that inner nature, we're not going to get the outer nature right. If we keep locked in this kind of formula we've been in for decades, the woe is me, shame on you, and just look at the polarization over an issue like climate change, and you can see that doesn't really go anywhere. It's a push me, pull you process that is really fundamentally not constructive. And when you look at the problems that we face now, they're not like the ones that were there in the mid-20th century when you had the Hudson River literally full of things like condoms and crap. And when I wrote about it in the mid-90s, when the Hudson River was largely substantially restored, Shabazz Jackson, who was a recycling merchant in Newburgh, talked about, they used to have a stroke in the Hudson River. We'd swim like this as a kid to sort of move all this stuff to the sides. It's not that simple now. Greenhouse gases are a globally mixed phenomenon. The greenhouse gases being emitted in China and India through the coming decades are going to swamp whatever small gains we might get here through tweaking our efficiency and in Europe. So if you're not thinking about global warming as a global problem, and again, too much of our initiatives on that side, I think, were focused in ways that really weren't realistic. If you don't really realistically embrace the nature of that problem, you're not going to get that right. So in this new century, and you would think that means, so what do we do? Well, the question, what we do is we get engaged. And what I see in this room, when I was talking to the ecology and evolution folks, and around these posters that I got to look at earlier, and Patricia Wright on your campus is a great example of the scientist who is about purpose. And science is so great, and I almost became one as a kid. I really wanted, Jacques Cousteau, who wasn't even a scientist, just stuck a camera underwater and said, ooh la la, and I'm like, oh man, this is great. And I thought about marine biology, but then I realized it was really hard. You had to learn a lot of chemistry and statistics, and it was better for me ultimately to be a journalist and kind of explore that whole world. But scientists, it's great to be involved with that bug or that thing or that glacier, but we're at a point in our history where, especially with the explosion of communication options and the implosion of the thing called journalism, if scientists and their institutions aren't moving out into that world and communicating more creatively and aggressively, then that vacuum, and look around, there's no shortage of information. We're overdosed in information. So if the scientific enterprise isn't presented by scientists explaining their work and how science is a trajectory, that it involves implicit uncertainty. Uncertainty is a form of knowledge that then the broader society is not, why would it embrace the things that they're working on? So again, with what Patricia is doing in Madagascar, and many, many other people in this faculty and other faculties and in other institutions around the world are doing, is science with an awareness of the context. And not everybody has to be a Jim Hansen and get out and write a book about his grandchildren and become a passionate activist and chain himself to coal-fired power plants and stuff like that. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. Not everybody's going to want to be Carl Sagan either, for those who remember who Carl Sagan was. I do. But there's a sense of, if you don't have that context and you're just studying your thing, there's a chance your thing will just kind of go away and you, wow, what happened? In fact, one of the pieces I haven't quite written for .earth yet is about Joe Mendelson. There's a paper out in Herpetological Review. He's a scientist, he's a biologist, and there's this key line, I won't be able to quote it directly, but essentially he says, deep in the piece, it should have been the opening phrase of this essay of his in Herpetological Review. And if I was his editor, I would have changed that. But he says, I got into herpetology because I really wanted to work with animals. I never thought I'd end up being more like a paleontologist. So many things he's studying are extinct or already basically the living dead. There's this frog, the Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog, which is one of the, these many amphibians that have been devastated by chytrid fungus. And there are two left. One is at the Zoo Atlanta, and one is at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. They're both male, and they haven't heard the frog in calling out in nature since 2006. So he's, and he's studying these animals, saying, why wasn't I more engaged with, actually getting the word out that we need to conserve what we can, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of late for him, but it's early still for many of you and many of us in terms of saving developing a sort of a culture and ethic that is more attuned to fitting our nature on this finite planet. And so when I talk about peak everything and peak us, and I'm going to explain what I mean a little bit. This is hold on, sorry. This is us. This is a political cartoonist's portrait of the human adventure for the last 100,000 years. Essentially, it's like we're just diddling along, and then zoom, 200 years, fossil fuels, technology. Look what we can do, Ma. Something about our trajectory these last couple of centuries reminds me of puberty. That sort of adolescent spree when you're out there just consuming all this great stuff. And the other word I use a lot these days is the word puberty. Again, it's the sense that we're now poised for that transition that almost everybody, are there any kids? Virtually everyone in this room went through a transition from that adolescent attitude, that relationship with the planet around us, meaning your yard and your school, that didn't have that sense of future, didn't have that sense of obligation, the sense of ethics. We all kind of were like that. I accidentally lit a fire in the forest behind my school one time. I dropped some sparklers into the grass, and I didn't tell anybody about that for years. Boy, that stuck in my head. That was stupid of me, but now I'm a little more grown up about my failures than I was then. So we have to make this transition from spiking to something new. It will happen by 2050. It will either be enforced upon us by outer limits, or we can modulate those trajectories. And that's where science comes in, science and other things, including the science of the psychology, which is how can we look at ourselves, regard ourselves, start to put ourselves back in this picture that we used to call nature, normalize that, and then find ways to modulate meaningfully before we hit the edge of the petri dish. I'm going to fast forward to get to this point that I wanted to make. You'll see a couple of these slides later. This is a petri dish. This is bacteria growing on agar. And science is kind of like saying, hey, look, there's the edge. We're coming near the edge. There are finite things. The atmosphere has a limited capacity to absorb greenhouse gases without big ramifications. Natural systems, the oceans, and acidification. We don't know how that's going to play out largely, but we know that there's a big chemical change going on in the oceans. But then again, the human nature part is scientists look at ourselves, and the ones who study us, like we study this stuff, and they say, you're not going to get this right. You are not going to get this right. And these are the reasons why. And they have all these reasons. The limited basket of worry. Anybody, are there any sociologists in the room? We all have a finite basket. Hooray. We need more of you. And the physical scientists need to have lunch with you guys, and vice versa. So we can kind of get more familiar and comfortable with these inner limits. The finite basket of worries is, I'm worried. I've got this overdue writing project, and I really should be working on it right now. And my kids are not worried about climate change. They're worried about their relationships with their other friends. And we're worried about paying our bills. And we're worried about the price of gas. And then someone comes along and say, if you stay on this trajectory of greenhouse gases, you're going to have really big bad consequences in coming decades, mostly somewhere else, like Bangladesh. And how are we, when you have a finite basket of worry, how does that fit in? And that's one of like a half dozen of these traits that we have that are trouble. So the big question is, how do we do that? How do we do that? The first thing is we get together with sociologists. We learn about ourselves. We get more comfortable with ourselves as a species. So here's us on our agar. This is London from the space station, taken by a guy I've gotten to know. A great thing about journalism is you get to know some really cool people. I'm looking forward to knowing Patricia better and her work. But I got to know Don Pettit, who's an astronaut who spent 6 months in the space station. He took a lot of pictures of cities in those days when he didn't have a lot to do. And it looks like something spreading on agar. And there are actually a few people who've written treatises about how we're kind of like a cancer. You look at that and some people would say, oh, it's a cancer. In fact, though, this picture is actually a really promising one. Because as some of you probably know, cities, we're becoming an urban species. And the faster we do that, if we can do it and have functional cities that have sanitation, that have access to education and good prospects for young people particularly, you could actually have a substantial impact on our transition to being more sustainable. Many cities are much more efficient than if we all stayed spread out in other areas. And so that's a good prospect, even though it looks kind of cancerous. Now I'm going to quickly go through my own learning curve, which started after I got out of Brown University with a biology degree. I went to the Pacific, and I got a fellowship to study man's relationship to the sea. I seduced this committee handing out this fellowship with a really romantic idea. And I went to this village called Futuna in French Polynesia. There was no electricity. There was one telephone, no paved road, and I loved it. We lived, they fished on the reef. They went to bed at sunset. We got up at dawn. We dug up the volcanic mountainside to plant sweet potatoes. You take all the little rocks out, put the dirt back in. And I learned, about the value of that kind of work. And it just felt so great. Now, I went back there 10 years later to write an article for Islands magazine. And parts of life there were still like they were. It's this place where people just sort of are. They get the work done, and then you're just like, kind of like that. It was so neat. And then finally I understood how Paul Gauguin, made those old paintings of people just kind of like that. And these women were like that just because they didn't have to run anywhere. They weren't thinking about the groceries or whatever. But then, when I went back in 1988, the kids had junk food. The electricity had come in. The road was paved. They had telephones. And so they were staying up late at night watching American soap opera Santa Barbara, and they're dubbed into French on their black and white TV. And they had to run up into the banana plantation to sort of move the antenna around a little bit. They were selling beer out of a cooler through a window they had cut in the side of their thatched hut. And I'm going, no, don't do this. Go back. But then, I kind of left, and I felt sad about some of the things I was seeing. They were staying up, sleeping in and drinking more, and there was more alcohol problem. But then I said, and the kids were moving to Papeete, the capital, which was a really sort of polluted, dysfunctional city in the middle of paradise. But I said, who am I to tell them don't go there? And this gets back to this human nature thing, this inner nature thing. And I would love to go back. I haven't been back since 1988 to see how things have worked out. I have a feeling it's a mixed bag, kind of like life tends to be. But it was this journey that made me want to be a journalist. And it wasn't just because, Carl, you'll like this picture. This is me with a very large king mackerel kind of. Any idea what that is? This was in the Tasman Sea. Wahoo, yeah. We were saying wahoo because that was like dinner for several days. That was in the Tasman Sea. I joined the crew of a sailboat and sailed from there 2/3 of the way around the world on the tail end of this fellowship. The moral of the story for all you young students who might go to some place to do some work is if you can stay there and do something really weird and get off the beaten track, do it when you're young because it's a lot harder to do it later. And then we were in the Maldives. I was the one who had to go up in the mast periodically to make sure we weren't going to hit something. There was no GPS back then. We had a $75 plastic sextant. And so I started to see the amazing world, this amazing world. We were out in the middle of the Indian Ocean in a sailboat, 1,000 miles from land in just about every direction, 2 miles deep water underneath you. And we were becalmed for several days. And that was it, sort of like being in Tahiti. We're just there. So we jumped over the side. And I don't know if anyone has ever swum in 2.5 mile deep water where you see your shadow go down to the vanishing point. And the boat you just dove off looks really tiny. And you have this great feeling of puniness that I wish everyone could have once in a while because we feel so empowered most of the time. And there was this one night on that trip where I was alone at 2 a.m. in the morning. I was the only person awake at the wheel. And I'm just there, and it was beautiful, also in the Indian Ocean. Suddenly there was this right behind me. Yeah, and it scared the crap out of me because the wheel on that boat was right at the stern. And it was a whale of some kind, and boy, was that cool. And those experiences made me want to tell stories, made me want to be a communicator. And then this kind of story made me want to be a communicator too. This was in Djibouti, right near, this was the, where all those pirates are now, near Somalia. And we actually worried about pirates even then. This was 1980 by this time. And walking around in Djibouti, all there is French Foreign Legionnaires, like these sunburned guys. They actually had the French Foreign Legion still at that time, I think. I don't know if they still do. And I'm walking down, and there was this pile of leopard skins on the corner. And at first I thought it was rugs or something. Then I realized, whoa, that's a lot of leopards. And I'm thinking, and I wasn't really thinking about this thing called sustainability yet, but something about this picture made me say, this is not sustainable. How could they possibly have harvested so many leopards? And again, these things wanted me to come back, made me want to come back and write. And then finally, we stopped in the Red Sea at this uninhabited island called Zubair, I think, which is kind of like halfway between Yemen and Ethiopia. And we parked there for a couple of days, and I went for a little walk around to the windward side of the island. We anchored on the leeward side. And there were all these, I walked there on my own, just musing, And the whole beach was covered, littered thick with shoals of light bulbs. Light bulbs. I mean, there was other stuff too, and I'm like, what the heck is this? And there were different kinds. And I realized they must have accumulated over a long period of time, thrown from a ship or whatever. And I mean, there's no big cities anywhere near. And that, I wrote about that many, many years later in a Times essay on sustainability. And it was one of these slow drip things where I had the sense of one light bulb washing up, every month or two. But after many years, you have this beach covered bizarrely in light bulbs. And they were intact. They were the ones that got just above the high tide line, just far enough that they would not stay there forever, essentially. And that, too, struck me as powerful. And then finally, so this was an 18-month journey. It was a very lucky thing to be able to do. And we were in Greece, finally, and the boat was going to go around the world, but I ended up getting off the boat shortly after, not too long after this picture was taken. There's something really wrong with this picture, right? The boat is clearly in water that's too shallow. I was at the wheel again, at night again, and there was this big storm that came up while everyone was asleep. And it was around 1 in the morning, and we didn't have GPS, and the skipper, the owner of the boat, who was aboard when this happened, he wasn't aboard all the time. He had kind of scrimped on the charts. This was an area we were just going to pass through, so he didn't buy the really detailed chart. The Gulf of Patras in Greece. And up ahead there was this light, and I didn't know whether I should go to port or starboard, but I couldn't leave the wheel because the wind was coming up. It was like 40 knots of wind, and everyone else was asleep. And suddenly I felt that the most horrible feeling you can experience, which is going about 10 knots, and your boat suddenly kisses the bottom. Boom, 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 and then suddenly bang, bang, bang. And I'm sliding onto this sandbar, and suddenly everybody's on deck. And this was the next morning. It's like, oh my God. We were there for 2 or 3 days trying to get off. And we finally, actually another storm helped work us off the reef, but we had wrecked the boat. We got towed into a port, and as the boat was pulled out, the bottom collapsed. The water, the pressure of the water was holding the hull of the boat together and until we got out of the water, and then it collapsed. So that was interesting. We fixed it after about a month of work. There's a long story there. And then I realized, the world is round. You start going around the world as a young person, and you realize, oh, I'm coming back to the other side again. I better get something done with my life. So journalism was the thing. And, whoops, sorry. Going the wrong way. What's going on here? Hold on. I'm caught in some time warp. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so I came back to this. This is the world as we know it. This is Los Angeles. I started to write about, I went to journalism school, came out and started writing about science and the environment and about pollution. Because remember, back in the 20th century, pollution was like this. You could actually see it. It's not like carbon dioxide, which is right here, right now. And we're just sort of dealing with it. And now I write about problems like carbon dioxide. And I did this piece on .earth a couple of years ago, musing on the question, what if CO2 were pink? And this was an illustration. This is a photo illustration. It's not a real photo. And I said, if it was pink, if the atmosphere was kind of pinkifying, would we start to get it better? But I'm trying to articulate the fundamental differences again between the problems of the 20th century and those we face now. They're much more abstract. And it's not pink. And there's so many other issues about these kinds of problems that are super slow-mo and not easy for us to get into gear on. So I've spent a lot of time writing about this stuff. From way back, 1988, Discover magazine. Even then, in 1988, we were trying to figure out ways to jar people in looking at global warming. The melting, wax Earth on us, hot skittle. How many different variants of that have you seen on magazine covers or book covers over the years? But so that was before the IPCC. That was the year the IPCC was created. It was the year Jim Hansen testified for the first time in a prominent way about global warming. This was an issue, even though other warnings had come as far back as the 70s and even the 50s to some extent. And then ever since then, I've been kind of fixated on this issue and many others as well. When I went to the Amazon to write The Burning Season, it was not about climate change, although I covered that aspect of it. That was my first realization that most environmental stories, the environment part of it is a symptom of some other thing. In the Amazon, you had this clash of cultures, ranching culture, development coming into an area that was inhabited until then mostly by Indians and rubber tappers who had been there for 100 or so years as a separate kind of white culture. And that was very important for me. And I wrote the book about, essentially it was a book about a labor and land rights issue that had environmental implications. It was about the murder of Chico Mendes. And then 1992, I wrote my first book on global warming. Unfortunately, the world was cooling at that time. If you think there's been a fight about cooling lately, back then Mount Pinatubo had erupted in the Philippines and had actually measurably, tangibly cooled the planet. So if you write a book on global warming, don't do it while the world's cooling. It's not a good marketing strategy. And the issue went away completely through the 90s, not just because of Mount Pinatubo, but because oil prices were plummeted after the Persian Gulf War, and we just kind of like went to sleep. And you'll see a graph later that indicates just how deep that sleep has been for a long time on energy. And then I went to, more recently I went to the North Pole and got to write a book for the next generation, for young people. And I think so much potential lies there in telling stories for them and with them, as opposed to us more fossilized folks like me. And then I did do all this newspaper writing. I kind of backed into the New York Times. Most people come to the Times and then try to get a book deal and then maybe someday have something made into a movie. I kind of did it all in weird reverse. But it was a fascinating experience. It was like going to the rainforest, actually, because the newsroom was like a jungle. It was full of all the competitive elements in the newsroom are like the plants, the vines, and all vying for the light in a forest. And, anytime there's a chink, something grows there. And in the newsroom, the light is the front page. So the stuff that gets on the front page is the stuff that competes best in that environment. And of course, the editors, if you give an editor a choice between a story on something stock swindle that just happened, or a new bomb went off in Israel or in Iraq, and hey, there's a new report out on clarifying a little bit what's going on with the West Antarctic ice sheet. What are they going to put on the front page? And so often, I've actually heard that phrase, didn't we already write that? Like global warming, didn't we already do that? And so it's these stories that are incremental in develop over time and that are complex. Don't make the grade. And I kind of fought that fight for a very long time. Got a lot of stories on the front page on various aspects of this. Unfortunately, it was usually about the politics. The politics would pull a story onto the front page much more often than the science would, which is unfortunate. Just quickly, these are some of the impediments. There was a woman, she's an MD here, who's heading to Saudi Arabia. There you are. This is one of the things I'll send you. The newsroom is filled with hurdles that a story has to overcome to get into print. There's the hurdle of the peg, which means what happened today? Did it happen today? Why do we have to put it in the paper tomorrow? Hey, tornadoes, easy. Climate change, not so. The tyrannies of space and time, of course, those are both shrinking. We're all overloaded now, so we have no time and space to write a thorough, carefully reported piece. So you're in a rush. The tyranny of balance. When you're in a rush, who do you talk to if you want to get a story done in a hurry? People who are easy to quote, people who are easy to kind of find. And who's easy to find? Advocates. So if you're in a hurry, you go on Google or just by whatever means, you'll find the people who want to find you. And so you won't find the hardworking scientists who actually know the most about sea ice or tornadoes in a warming world. And you'll end up with this kind of he said, she said stories that have no real meaning. And that's a big problem. The lure of conflict, of course, ClimateGate was a classic instance where the conflict, the personality issues dominated by far what it said about science. And then, as I said, the lure of the front page thought, which is kind of in there as well, that sense of drama, which often would cause a newspaper writer, I've seen this kind of coverage over the years, to overstate something or just play down the nuance, because everyone in the newsroom kind of wants to play down the nuance. And the people feeding them that want to play down the nuance because it needs to get on the front page. So that all gets very discouraging after a while. And one thing that I've learned is that there's also this mishmash, this thing called global warming. I put this on my blog the other day, a version of this graph. Global warming has no meaning. That phrase, global warming, has no meaning on its own. Do you mean that the world is warming? Absolutely. Do you mean that humans are causing that warming? That's a separate question. Do you mean how fast are sea levels rising? That's a very complicated question with no easy answer. How warm is the world going to get? If you double CO2? Very hard question. Durable uncertainty in a wide range of outcomes. So if you write about this as this thing called global warming, you're bound to have distortion because everyone has a different definition. A libertarian and a liberal and a scientist have utterly different definitions of that term. And then remember, tyranny of space and time, that means you have less time and space to articulate that in a story. That's trouble. Just one quick illustration. Think about hurricanes, and if you want to do a story on hurricanes in a hurry, you call Kerry Emanuel at MIT and Chris Landsea, who is at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're both real hardworking, successful scientists studying hurricanes in a warming world. They have utterly divergent views of what's driving change already, and it's really a tough thing. So this dictum, for every PhD there's an equal and opposite PhD, has to kind of, we have to find ways forward around that. And there are ways, but they're too long to discuss in a talk on peak everything and peak us. So that's for another day. I talked about some of that earlier today. I'm going to speed through some things. Now here we get to the cultural issue and the psychology. I did a piece not long ago after I started talking to a guy named Dan Kahan, K-A-H-A-N, at Yale. He's in the law school, but he studies this thing called cultural cognition. What is it that makes certain people perceive the world in fundamentally different ways than others? And they've done a lot of hard research, quantitative work, experiments where you give people the same piece of information but presented with different pictures, like a different kind of person, someone in flannel or someone who looks conservative, and they have a completely different response and reaction and absorption of that information. And that stuff is so important, and it explains so much about the durable differences within our communities over an issue like global warming. And it's very much discounted among the environmental groups and among the science community doing the IPCC reports. There are hardly any sociologists in that process of creating the IPCC report. The section on policy doesn't really have a section on how humans, an analysis of how humans make policy in the face of uncertainty. So and I did this piece basically, these are 4 different Nobel Prize winning physicists. Each one has a very different and distinct view of the global warming issue. This guy you probably know really worries about it. He's the energy secretary, Steve Chu. Ivar Gaever up there, he's really pissed off about overstatement. He thinks he doesn't think it's a hoax, but he thinks it's been drastically overstated. He's at Rensselaer, or he's retired now. And Laughlin and Burton Richter up there has written a very good book about energy. He's more in the Steve Chu camp. And Laughlin's kind of in between. So you can go out with your cultural biases, find your own Nobel Prize winning physicists to hold up in your arguments about global warming. What does that say? That says a couple things. It says don't expect to win an argument over this. Don't expect to win over society, given the sociological, again, realities of how we deal with problems and risk. That doesn't mean you can't do anything. It means you start to think about how do you find common ground? How do you move forward in a landscape with that kind of level, those layers of difference? And there are ways forward. And your other choice is to just stay in the old mode, that old woe is me, shame on him. You know, Al Gore and Senator Inhofe. And Senator Inhofe would love to keep this argument in that space because this is what activists, people with edge opinions thrive on. If an argument moves toward consensus, that's dangerous for someone like that, or someone who just wants stasis. And the problem, of course, with global warming, the other big problem, the other reality of this issue is that there's a law of physics separate from like the radiative forcing of greenhouse gases and all that stuff that really matters. It's inertia. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. And society on fossil fuels is like the ultimate example of an object very comfortably at rest. And that's why it doesn't take a lot of work for those who want stasis to keep the object at rest. It takes a huge amount of work to start to nudge, to have substantive change. And I just don't see the polarization kind of approach working in the future. Now, here's the media question. So the old days, way back in that 20th century, when the problems were so simple, we also had this communication simplicity. There was a guy named Walter Cronkite. For those of you born recently, you may not know about this, who every night we would sit as a family at dinner and the TV would be on and he'd end every nightly broadcast with this very reassuring, that's the way it is. And so we were handed our information by the media in a very comfortable way. It was like we all had this national communal comfort food supper of mac and cheese every night. Maybe sometimes it was pork and beans or something. It was always just this really wonderful. And we all walked home and we had that sense of common purpose and worries. And now, like, you go out there now and it's this. It's like everything. So we still dine on comfort food now. But now it's like the world's biggest buffet. It's like one of those Chinese buffets times 10 because it's a Swedish buffet and a Chinese buffet. And if you like sushi, you can get your sushi. If you like naysaying, anti-science rhetoric, you can go to a website for that. You can go to What's Up With That if you care about stasis and you want to learn everything that someone is saying isn't true without actually testing. And if you're really worried about climate, you can be very comfortable at Climate Progress. If where you're there, and it's like being in a little cafe with everyone who feels the same way you do. Most blogs are like that. It's like free drinks and comfy couches for people who are like me. And is that going to solve the world's problems if we're all in our little bunkers, just sort of hunkering down and listening, taking information that suits our predispositions? I don't think so, but unfortunately, that's our habit. So the web right now is feeding a bad habit. It's like us being confronted with fast food as well. It's just the same thing. It's feeding our primordial bad habit of, oh man, some protein, some fat, some sugars. Get it now, get it now. So we have to figure out ways to make the web work more effectively, and I do think there are ways forward. They're not always easy, but I think there are ways. And here's one way that I tried. And now this involves a couple of things. This is a scientist who decided to be a communicator, working with a journalist who's trying to figure out different ways to communicate science. So his name is Andy Bunn. He's from Western Washington University. In partnership with Woods Hole, 2 years ago, they went to Siberia. I think they're going every year. And they take a barge down one of those amazing rivers and doing paleoclimatology work. And I wasn't going to go with them because it's kind of like Minnesota up there. A lot of mosquitoes. In fact, you can see there's stuff here that looks like dust on the negative. But of course, this is a digital photo. There's no negative. That's all these giant mosquitoes. Anyway, I said, look, this sounds like a really cool project. I'm not going to go with you. But if you have a camera and an audio recorder, could you record an audio narration, sort of a narrated little explanation of what you're doing? Send me some pictures, and I'll put something on .earth. So we did these. I've been doing them ever since. They're called postcards from people doing interesting things or having an interesting observation while they're somewhere else. And I think it's a new medium. It's not journalism. It's not a scientist's blog. It's a curated conversation with scientists in the field. And the New York Times now has institutionalized this in the science section. There's a blog called Scientists at Work, which is basically a full-time version of these little experiments I do once in a while. And I think they're a great kind of thing to do. Then there are people like Richard Alley at Penn State. I'm sure some of you know Richard. He's the ultimate example of the out there communicator. He does really bad imitations of Johnny Cash. And he turns Johnny Cash songs into songs about black carbon and the Milankovitch cycle. If you Google the phrase, the singing climatologist, and you'll find a post about me and his singing. If you Google the dancing climatologist, you'll find a video I shot of him doing he does a little, it's kind of like davening in temple. I don't know if any Jews, he explains the Milankovitch cycle by saying his bald spot is the North Pole, his nose is the equator, and he kind of dances, and every 20,000 years he does this, and it's great. And it's caught tens of thousands of views of people who probably wouldn't have been thinking about the Milankovitch cycle very much otherwise. Now, not everybody's going to be Richard Alley either. There are students who are experimenting. I'm not sure if this would work. Anyway, there's a video that's on .earth. I'm not going to risk stirring things up, of students explaining geoengineering with kind of a Charlie Chaplin-esque comic routine where they deploy space mirrors that are just a white umbrella and stuff like that. And that's gotten a lot of play on YouTube. So there's ways to be creative. I think if there is more creativity, there can't be enough creativity. And I recently did a post. If you want to learn more about the unconventional approaches to communicating science, search for the phrase online, nerd loop. Randy Olson, who's a sort of a lapsed marine biologist who's become a filmmaker, and he wrote a book called Don't Be Such a Scientist, which I recommend, spoke to me for .earth about this thought he has that we've been stuck too much in what he calls a nerd loop, where we're just talking to each other about how to communicate instead of actually trying to communicate with the actual world. And that's a very valuable thing to think about these days. Now there's other experiments underway, and I joined the faculty at Pace University a year ago, and I started brainstorming with other faculty about how to integrate the environment and sustainability issues into other parts of the curriculum. There's an annual course in how to make a documentary done by the media department, and they do it on their spring break. They always go some goofy place and that kids would want to go anyway. And so we brainstormed, and I'd always wanted to learn more about this particular shrimp aquaculture project in Belize. And they all liked the idea of going to Belize because the coral reefs and everything. So we did that. We were there for a month and a half ago, spring break, for about a week, shooting intensively. They spent a chunk of days just shooting this video focused on a woman named Linda Thornton, who's an American expat there working in shrimp farming to cut the impacts. And it was fantastic. It's going to be a great film. You can follow their blog. They're on Twitter. It's got_shrimp on Twitter. And most of them had not been on Twitter before. I forced them. Me, the 55-year-old guy, is forcing these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids to get onto the internet, which is kind of bizarre. And they're learning that Twitter actually is a two-way street. It's a wonderful tool. It's not just people saying, hey, I'm going to brush my teeth now, I'm really bored. There's some of that. But it can be used as a creative learning tool as well. There's a woman at UConn, just across Long Island Sound here, who teaches her bird biology class. One of the things they have to do is get Twitter accounts. And right now, if you go on Twitter and you put in the hashtag, the phrase bird class with a pound sign in front of it, you'll see their assignment is they have to go out, when they're out in the world, like running to a course or going home, they have to, if they see a bird doing something interesting, they have to tweet it, which is kind of fun. And it's prompted them, inspired them to watch birds in ways that many of them said they never really had done before because they were putting it through their little digital interface. I think that's kind of a great thing. The arts can play a role. This was in New York City a couple of years ago to celebrate Sanitation Day, World Sanitation Day. Some artists were trying to illustrate something I've been writing about for a lot on .earth, which the Water Brigade is very focused on here, which is there are 2.6 billion people on the planet with no place to safely do a number 2. And that has huge ramifications, obviously, for water and health. And so this was sort of like, what if city folk had no toilet? And there's a guy crouching behind his briefcase. And, so it's, whether that you think that works or not, then do something more creative. That's the whole idea, is to kind of experiment. And I think it's a valuable thing for the arts to do. There's much that's been done recently just in terms of what happened in Japan that's involved the arts that I think is very, very worth looking at. And then there's this, the realities of what's going on in nature are very powerful. And as I said at the beginning, there's this idea of the biologist whose whole field is essentially kind of evaporating in front of him, amphibians, recognizes this very powerfully. But it's not just things going away. We're moving stuff around in ways that's just mind-blowing. And I'm sure there are people here studying all kinds of invasive species. And the lionfish, I recently did some coverage of them coming up. They're actually off Long Island Sound. Have you seen any, Carl, here?
Yes.
Anybody here caught a lionfish? Or
There's a lot of them around Long Island.
Yeah, so I did this piece, with other various invasives, not just alien species, like feral pigs, they're not alien, but they're invasive. Eat them. And so there's this eat lionfish move going on. You have to eat lionfish very carefully. You have to prepare them carefully, get rid of those fins first. There's a website called lionfishhunter.com. Guy in the Bahamas has like 100 different recipes for lionfish. So I wrote about that. Now the sad part is things are going away. I've had to write 2 quasi-obituaries for species. One was Miss Waldron's red colobus, and now they think it's actually not quite extinct. It's like, okay, so it's not quite extinct, great. But I wrote it almost made it onto the front page when a paper came out asserting that it was gone. And then I had to write about the Baiji, the river dolphin in the Yangtze River, which had been there happily kind of doing the dolphin thing for 20 million years, and then 400 million Chinese moved into its watershed. And it's like, oh, this is not working. And it wasn't, unlike in the Amazon where there's active hunting of dolphins right now for various reasons, there it seemed to be mostly just that this species is not compatible with having 400 million people in that watershed. It was a series of insults and problems with shipping traffic, and now it does seem to be gone forever. And that's a really sad and powerful thing. There are other, especially these species that are in niches, either on islands or in rivers, where they're unique and kind of bunched up. That's a big problem. And then there are promising things going on. I've been writing over and over the last few months, last year or two, about increasingly aggressive efforts to cut the flow of the trade in endangered species. I was so excited when I saw this story out of Bangkok about this little tiger cub, which I don't know if anyone saw this. This was, a woman was trying, in her checked baggage, she had a big heap of stuffed tiger toys and a living tiger cub, Like, that's gonna not, that'll fool them. It didn't fool them. And so I was thrilled that the guy at the X-ray machine said, hey, there's something wrong here. And she got arrested. And there's more, in China even, there are some signs, I think, of some shift toward cracking down on some of this kind of really terrible pressures on wildlife. And that's promising to me. And there are things we forget. In all of our talk about energy policy here, again, we've neglected to really embrace the reality that in this planet right now, as we head toward peak us, there are two fundamental shapes to the energy challenge. There's 2 billion people with a B who basically have no energy options. If they have any light, it's some guttering little kerosene lantern, and when they cook, it's on an indoor fire emitting toxic smoke that kills 1 million or 2 kids and women prematurely every year. And the stain on the wall above that stove says a lot. And there are some moves underway to move vented stoves, to come up with cheap versions of vented stoves and more efficient fuels that can make a difference. And in places like that, fossil fuels actually should play as much a role as are needed to help get them out of this utter tragedy called energy poverty. And what's been notable to me is that the environmental community was kind of neglecting that side of the energy challenge and trying to push so hard for a Kyoto Treaty and stuff and focus so much on legislation that who took over that issue? You know who co-opted that? The fossil fuelers. When I went to Cancun this year for the climate talks, the guy handing out end energy poverty ribbons, was from a pro-fossil fuel, anti-regulatory, anti-environmental group. And that said, and I wrote about it at the time saying, this is kind of weird. There's much more to say about that. If you go to the blog and look for the phrase end energy poverty, you'll see there's a different punchline about what was going on there as well. And we've really done amazing things with reducing child mortality. Don McNeil, one of my friends at the paper, wrote this landmark story, I think it was 3 years ago, when the World Health Organization reported with much drama that the child mortality had dropped below 10 million a year. And that's an amazing accomplishment, especially considering there's 7 billion of us now. So as the overall population has been soaring, the proportion of people dying young is really shrinking rapidly. But 10 million a year is still a bad deal. And especially because that's concentrated in areas that are really sources of great dysfunction that can have much broader ramifications for the world generally. So I took this picture in the Amazon, actually. This was a long time ago, 1990, in Manaus, a big city. There was open air shops, and I'm walking down these row of shops, and to see a funeral parlor where there's coffins stacked like Starbucks coffee cups in all sizes, and have that be normal struck me as incredibly frustrating. And even though there's been, again, great progress, including in the Amazon, there's so much more to do there. And it's such low-hanging fruit. The sanitation stuff, cleaner water stuff, a little energy goes a huge way. And there's the promise, this is like our energy issue, is real and substantial and important. And when Lee Shipper, there's a guy at Stanford University, like every 2 months, he sends me a photo from his iPhone. He goes into a supermarket when he sees a refrigerator section with no doors. It drives him crazy, or a freezer section. And I'm sure some market that you go to has this. And again, this is the norm. We are so flush with energy that we can just let frozen food bask in energy, meaning the coolness, and not think about it. That's got to change. And these technologies have a role right now, and you'll see one of these that's truly revolutionary in a minute, but it's not here. So here, $40,000 on one of these panels is an indulgence to me, when you see what it could do. That same 40 grand somewhere else could do a huge bit more. And then oil, when I didn't get to go down there, I'm no longer on the staff at the Times, so when the Gulf spill happened, I was writing about it continually from a kind of a wonky policy, admittedly thumbsucky way. But actually there was an advantage to that. And the advantage was one day, as I was sitting at home, waiting for Obama to give his speech, I went down to the basement. We live in the Hudson Valley. Like many people in this region, we have oil heat. And I contemplated, we had recently had to deal with the idea that our rusting oil tanks needed to be replaced. And I remember having this, I loved the idea of moving to geothermal or something, but I never, unlike more successful writers, I've never had a bestseller and stuff. So it was too expensive. It really was not realistic. And I had to buy new oil tanks. That was a really bummer for me, the fact that I couldn't come up with something that was going to get me off the oil habit. So when I wrote about the Gulf spill, I said, part of that spill belongs to me, as long as I'm driving a car, and I have a Prius, but we also have a minivan because sometimes we have to drive longer distances with a bunch of crap. And I have to kind of internalize that and make sure that this is the end of the woe is me, the shame on you thing. If I just keep pointing at Exxon or BP and not acknowledge and integrate the reality that we have to change things too in our personal lives, in our priorities, how we vote, and how we design our local zoning laws, then I'm not really engaged in the energy quest. And the reality still is coal is king. It will be king for a long time to come. If you don't believe that, go to the Peabody Energy Company's homepage, and they have a little sales ticker going there continually, and it's about 8 tons a second. I refer to it maybe once every 6 months, and it's going faster because they're now exporting. The US is starting to export coal from certain places to Asia, and Australia is exporting a lot of coal to China, and coal is still a big deal. And if you wanted to have something else like wind turbines supplant it, you better get off of the NIMBY boat, because to have that much distributed generation, you need a lot of wires. And as I wrote not long ago, if you love wind, you better at least like transmission. And of course, that's true for natural gas and other technologies as well. And getting real about these issues, being honest, brutally honest, I think in some cases is important. And the one thing, this gets back to what I said a little while ago about us being pretty much asleep. And this also, I think, helps eliminate that sense this is a partisan thing, that Republicans are worse than someone else. This is 50-year history of American scientific enterprise, reflected in this indirect proxy called federal R&D money. And over this side is Sputnik. So the Russians got into space, and we went, oh my God. And OMFG, for those who understand that stuff. And so we had a space race, and it's like, that's several tens of billions of dollars in constant dollars. This is all, inflation adjusted. So that's what a space race looks like. And it worked, it got us to the moon and all that. Then we had the war on cancer. That's the purple band at the top. And that didn't really work so well, actually. It was a lot of money, it still is. It's about $40 billion a year right now in basic medical research. This is not the health bill. This is just, medical science. And the energy part is the little green ribbon. That's all of our interest in energy is in that little ribbon. You can see there's this one kind of fat spot where it looks like a python that swallowed a tennis ball. That was in the oil crisis in the 70s. And then Ronald Reagan usually gets the blame for pulling the plug on that, and he did indeed. But no one ever put the plug back in. Look at this. Do you see any Republican or Democratic wiggles in that? Either White House or Congress? None. We've been, as I put it, we've been in a bipartisan slumber party for a couple of decades on the need for energy inquiry being an important thing for us. And you can see, wait, there's an uptick. That's the stimulus package you're seeing right there. A huge chunk of that is for this thing called carbon capture and sequestration, which is pretty much a pipe dream, the idea of taking CO2 from a coal-fired plant and sticking it back in the ground. Doing that at a large scale, you run the numbers. Actually, search for just Revkin coal pipe dream, and you'll find some analysis of that. And by the way, that's gone now. And anyone here in the sciences knows that if you want to have young students move into an area of discovery, an area of inquiry, a one-time expenditure, a one-time pulse of money like that is not going to be the trick. And that's away and gone away forever. Now we're in an era of declining R&D budgets, and you know why, because of the deficit and the debt. And so that was the energy quest, boom, and it's all gone. Even Obama's, the programs he has initiated for this blue sky breakthrough work, Congress, even when it was Democrat-controlled, barely gave him the money he was seeking. Energy and education money Obama was seeking, again, under a Democratic Congress, it wasn't there either, let alone under what's there now. So there is a huge opportunity in this. I wrote a piece called a 2 cent solution to the energy challenge. A 2 cent wiggle in the gas tax, 2 cents, would triple the energy R&D money. Oh, by the way, this is all energy R&D. This is fossil fuel energy R&D, nuclear, solar, and the other renewables are this tiny sliver of that. And by the way, all of that stuff, all those bands are the red here, and the gray is Defense Department military science. It's military R&D. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying if our goal with the military spending is security, and right now even the Pentagon, if you've heard about this Mr. Y essay that was fascinating, two senior Pentagon strategists saying, we need to redefine security, because if we don't have a strong economy and a strong scientific and intellectual base at home, we'll end up defending a hollow thing that will just collapse. So I think there's great opportunity to shift some of that initiative into new kinds of R&D. Whether it stays in the Pentagon or not almost is irrelevant. Now, and this is global. Anyone who thinks that this is an American-only problem, this is the IEA, International Energy Agency money. This is just energy. So if you took that little green ribbon and sliced it into slices, this is the stuff within energy that the world is focused on for R&D. And you can see, oh yeah, nuclear is orange. And blue got a big boost. That blue is fossil fuel R&D. That's carbon capture right there. And everything else is kind of going up a little bit. But remember, that's going to kind of go away. The only country of all the advanced industrialized countries that sustained a higher track for energy R&D proportional to their economy is Japan. And it's because they're an island and they have very limited energy choices, and even more limited now, as you know. Finally, so, and again, this mystery of how do we move beyond fossil fuels has been no mystery for a long time. Some of you may have, I'm sure someone here knows about this. Thomas Edison in 1931 said this, "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." It's like, hello? And you know what he was working on the final year of his life? An off-the-grid house. Not photovoltaics, other stuff, but he had that concept of distributed generation that he was working on in the last years of his life. I think that's something to think about too. Finally, just getting back to this idea of the divisions within our society and how we can get some paths around them. The Six Americas study is very worthwhile reading. It's Yale analysis, Yale and others. It's a periodic assessment of why people think what they think about global warming. Essentially, there's 6 kinds of Americans when you do that and really dive in. There's alarmed, as you can see, alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. Now, by the way, these bubbles have changed. This was 2009. They've changed shape a little bit. There's more dismissives and less alarms. But that's not the point here. The point here, this is cap and trade. This was when they were asked, all these people were asked, what do you think of this cap and trade idea? And you can see even the alarms were barely nudging above yes, maybe. They were all in the maybe zone. And of course, the alarms, the dismissives were no. And anyone who saw this in 2009 should have been saying, there's no way we're ever going to have a cap and trade bill if the alarms are not on board. Now, when they asked this question, support for providing rebates for purchases of solar panels, look how interesting that is. Everybody is above the midline, even the dismissives. Now that says to me, when you're talking about energy, you have a fundamentally different conversation. You're not locked into those polarized conversations around this amorphous concept called global warming that everyone has a different definition for. So there's a real sense of opportunity there. And so when oh yeah, here's another one. Same deal. This is on, this is even a mandate, to mandate to boost car efficiency. Even the dismissives are pretty close to the midline. That says something, again, very powerful to me. So if I had to choose a bumper sticker for my Prius, if I had to say fight the climate crisis or join the energy quest, I think I would go with the bottom one. They're both pretty wonky, geeky bumper stickers, but I'm a wonky, geeky guy. And this is a picture that I raced through at the beginning because I knew it would come back. So this is that other thing, that other energy challenge, closing out with this thought. And this is one little story. In a big chunk of Africa, this is the norm. If the kids in this city in Guinea, this is the capital city in Guinea, to do their homework, they have to go to the airport parking lot. That's the only place where there's electricity. So these are kids who are in school, doing their homework, who want to become a functional part of society, who want a job, who want to learn, and they're denied that right. Talk about a right, by the simple lack of a bulb. And that, to me, is a scandal in our time. And to think back, the $40,000 photovoltaic panel on some suburban house, think how much more power you'd get out of that same $40,000. If your concern is climate, and if your concern is sustainable prosperity, think about this picture. And by the way, the other issue with this picture, of course, is there's no girls. That's a whole other issue. And that's quite often because there's no sanitation at school, or something as simple as the fact that it's the girls who are sent out to collect firewood or who are sent out to collect clean water. So that makes those things even more powerful. They're not just about waterborne disease. They're about access to education and prosperity. Now, here's the story that I find most exciting of all. So this is a picture in December taken by a photographer who was with Libby Rosenthal from the Times in a rural hut in a village in Kenya, way off the grid, and there's a bulb there. There's light, and these kids are doing their homework at home instead of, well, they don't have an airport to go to. And they actually, it was quite clear these kids were doing very well in school as a result. The mother, a year ago, had gotten really tired of taking her cell phone once a week, because remember, you'll see in a second, there's a lot of cell phones in developing countries, even in places with no electricity. She had to take her phone into town once a week to charge it up at this ridiculous rate, like 50 cents per charge. She invested instead in a small solar panel, $60 solar panel. She stuck it on the roof of her thatched hut in this rural village. Her kids are doing their homework. She's got her cell phone charged. And then she starts charging her neighbors' cell phones for a small fee. Like half, I don't know what it was compared to going into town, but it was way less. So she set up a business. And then they're starting to buy solar panels. And that all happened. Talk about outside. What about leverage? Remember, think about leverage. We have to think less about leveraged buyouts and more about the leverage power of a little investment in a place like that. And I don't mean like philanthropy style investment. What I mean is that the innovation imperative of our time is not just about becoming an engineer, but about coming up with the social innovations and the financial innovations that can make an off-the-grid enterprise out of this kind of activity. Because, again, the benefits are explosive. Now, and then look at this. This image is the most important one, I think, in my talk, because it shows you the potential of communication and networking that's out there. In 2000, there were 700 million cell phones in the whole world. Most of them were in rich countries. 5 years ago, we'd passed this threshold. Most of the cell phones in the world were in poor countries, and there's 2 billion cell phones. Now, last year, there are 5-point-something billion cell phones. 3/4 of them are in poor countries. And that says, oh my God. So this kid sitting in a rural village in Africa, if there's even a remote amount of bandwidth, and I'm sure within a few years there will be much more, there is a digital divide. It's very deep, and I understand Patricia's going to bring bandwidth to parts of Madagascar that don't have it. So you can have this kid sitting at home doing his homework and potentially listening to a lecture at Stony Brook on his phone. And that says, whoa. And so education, talk about the world is flat. The world of information is becoming flatter than flat. It's like becoming like superconductivity, where there's just no resistance at all, potentially. If institutions like universities work on building those relationships, work on making a classroom here connect with the classroom in a developing country, making sure that we are maximizing, we're using all that leverage we can for progress on a finite planet. And the last couple of thoughts, and again, this is not just about science. This is design. This is engineering. I've written a lot, unfortunately, about earthquakes, and I started intensively on this after the Chinese quake in Sichuan province. And seeing schools, so many schools, so many thousands of kids died in buildings that had structure. They just weren't put together well. And if they had just put them together a little differently, they would have stood the test of time, and even in that great quake. And so here's a guy, Santiago Pujol. He's an earthquake engineer at Purdue. He came up with this alternative design for schools in developing countries that it's the exact same materials that are used in most developing countries, just configured differently. And it's a fundamentally more stable building. They put it on their big shake table out there. And you can see a YouTube video of it on .earth. And I would love this information, which is free, to be in every community in India, where, you remember, India is heading toward 1.6 billion people from 1.2 now in the next 30 years or so. And they can't build schools fast enough. So I'm just hoping that they'll build them smarter, just because people can share information at the speed of light right now. And I see, again, unbounded possibilities along those lines. And this is a two-way street. This is Seoul, South Korea. I was there a couple of years ago. And they've done something that some cities here are starting to think about. This used to be the corridor in Seoul. Pretty ugly place, and normally with a lot of traffic. And then the guy who's now the president of South Korea, when he was mayor, he said, let's take this out. There's a little tiny stream there that actually was the heart of our city 500 years ago, and let's restore it. And so they did this, which is a little bit like where the rubber duckies were today, in the sense that this is a very artificial river. They actually have to pump the water through it for the most part. But it's become a wonderful, cool zone in the middle of this incredibly crowded, dense concrete city. The temperature around it has gone down many degrees. The pollution has gone down. They've put in more bus lanes and less car lanes. And people by the thousands go there every evening to stroll, workers picnic there. So we can reinvent cities. It's totally possible, the ones that exist now. And Yonkers up the river here is trying to do the same thing. The Sawmill River goes under Yonkers, which is, the recession kind of got in the way of that. So again, great possibilities. And when I look around the landscape of what people are doing and not doing, when I go to the climate talks and see, I think basically well-meaning people like Todd Stern and his Jairam Ramesh from India and the Chinese colleague, they're doing their best, sort of, but they're really defending their country's interests more than they're doing something about climate change. I don't see that as a source of progress. And congressional hearings, and Jim Hansen is very well-meaning. That's him talking at a hearing a couple of years ago in Washington. But I don't really see people in suits being the source of the change that will make this a promising trajectory through this century. I see young people, basically, like this kid, I forgot his name, at MIT, who went to China one summer with his family, couldn't believe the traffic, said, I'm going to invent an electric motorcycle. And he did. And 9 billion people riding electric motorcycles is not going to save the planet, especially if it's coal-burned electricity. But his initiative, his sense of inquiry and enterprise, I talk about Generation E on my blog. It's not just E for environment. It's E for environment, energy, education, equity, and enterprise, meaning innovation. Then I have great hopes. And kids getting engaged and being pissed off sometimes. These were students in 2005 in Montreal. They were actually recognizing it's their atmosphere this is about, their climate system, their planet, way more than it's mine or any one of those people in suits. And they were actually going there and saying, hey, this matters to us. And that's important as well. And finally, this is my son. We went to the Smithsonian, I guess it was this winter, and one of the entomologists there took out the tray they call the Oh My drawer. I guess every entomological collection has that literally has a label on it, Oh My. And this is all the great beetles that they've collected over the decades and probably century and a half. And I would hate to think that kids will only have these kinds of options to look at some of what's out there in the world. But getting kids out into the world, I think, is part of making sure that that does not happen. So finally, there we are, Carl Sagan, who was very inspirational for me despite some issues. Where that little pixel there is, he gave that wonderful speech about the pale blue dot, which indirectly inspired me to call it .Earth. We have to, once in a while, pull back and just remember that amid all this complexity and all of our struggles, we really do have a very small piece of real estate here. And if we can't get sort of a modulated trajectory so that we determine peak us and some outside force doesn't, we'll be in for more regrets than we need to be. And that's kind of the story of my blog and what I focus on. And this is the last thing that I'll show is just this image of that an artist, again, a science illustrator in England, Adam Neiman, came up with this variant of a very familiar thing. This is the Earth, and it's all of its liquid water. But what he did was he quantitatively peeled all the water off of the planet, put it in a spherical volume. And that's it. That's everything. All of our liquid patrimony that we need to figure out how to share. Remember, that's 99? It's over 90% salt water. So that's pretty powerful to me. And again, it shows you the potential to think about ideas in new ways, reshape the information and present it in different ways. And that can make a difference, I think, potentially. If this was on the cover of every kid's basic geology textbook, that would be a great starting point. The pink bubble is all the world's atmosphere at sea level pressure. If you took all the air in the atmosphere, put it in a spherical volume, that's it. So, heading toward 9 billion people, we have to figure out how to sort of divvy that up in ways that we will, again, come with the fewest regrets. In the face of complexity and uncertainty, but with a sense of confidence in our capacity to experiment and move forward. So I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.